I think that it is important to understand a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about William Vacchiano and his teaching and his playing. Basically today, in the early part of the 21st century, what we know mainly is derived from anecdotal accounts from people who studied with Vacchiano or people who studied with Vacchiano's students. But the oldest of that group probably go back to students who worked with Vacchiano during the early 1960s. The other source, of course, is the excellent biography of William Vacchiano that was written by Professor Brian Shook. While these accounts are totally accurate and have great validity, they do, however, omit what I consider to be the most important period of William Vacchiano's teaching and playing, and that would be the period from approximately 1940 through 1960. These were arguably the most productive years that he had. He turned out, I think, his greatest crop of students during that time. He did his best playing in the New York Philharmonic during that time. And I think there are reasons for this. I think the first reason was that William Vacchiano had assumed the position of the principal teacher, or the primary teacher in New York City, following the careers or following in the footsteps of some of his own teachers, like Max Schlossberg, George Magier, Walter Smith, and so on. He knew and respected all of those teachers, and I think that he really wanted to make his mark, and he felt a great responsibility assuming that position. I mean, that was the kind of old world mentality that existed in those days. It was very important. They even wore suits and ties when they taught. It was a different world than it is today. This was not only an artistic consideration or an educational or pedagogical situation, it was also a business issue. We must remember that the major symphony orchestras in those days did not have year-round seasons as they do today. And so, in many respects, the teaching was every bit as important as the performing. When William Vacchiano joined the New York Philharmonic in the mid-30s, I think they had a 21-week season. Probably during the 1940s and 50s, it probably had a 35 or 40-week season. And so the teaching was very important. And as one famous horn teacher said, when his wife complained that he was spending too much time teaching and should really concentrate more on his orchestra playing, he was at the age where he said, no, it's the opposite. The orchestra is starting to crowd out my teaching, so I will concentrate on that. During the 1940s and 50s, William Vacchiano was one of the most strict disciplinarians as a teacher, probably in the history of brass instruments. When I was studying with William Vacchiano in 1961 through 1963, there was a good deal of that, but I'm certain that it wasn't as intense as the training that the people ahead of me received. I remember running into Melvin Broyles, coming out of a chock full of nuts coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan, and he said, "Oh, how are you doing? How are the lessons going?" And I said, I don't know if I can make it with this guy. He's killing me. I'm so depressed coming out of those lessons. And Mel said, "I know exactly what you're talking about." He said there were times when I would come out of my lessons and I would have tears in my eyes. It's because he was that demanding. I think it's important to note that he wasn't demanding in the old European style of being abusive. He was a perfect gentleman at all times, but he was demanding. Very much in the same way that the composer-conductor Pierre Boulez can be demanding. He can be the most difficult person to work with on the planet Earth. But Pierre Boulez never raises his voice at anyone. He just simply sits and says, "It's not right. It's not working. It's not right." That's how Vacchiano was. He went over and over and over things, and they weren't right. And he wouldn't let up until you got them right. There are also a number of anecdotal accounts of others who studied with William Vacchiano during those years. I've heard from a number of sources of students of Armando Guitarra asking him if he would show them some of the things that Vacchiano had shown him. And Mundy would say, "I wouldn't put another human being through what William Vacchiano put me through." And even the redoubtable Miles Davis, who was famous for his pugilistic attitude towards many, admitted to some of his colleagues that William Vacchiano was one of the few human beings on the planet who frightened him. All of Vacchiano's students, at least up until 1970, were familiar with something the students called Vacchiano's rules. Some students even referred to them as Vacchiano's rules of trumpet playing. They were not Vacchiano's rules, and they were not rules about trumpet playing. They were simply basic principles of solfege as taught to performers, mainly in Western Europe, and especially at the Paris Conservatory in the early part of the 20th century. Remember, because of the Great War that ended in 1917, that many of the countries were not functioning so well, and so students from all over the world studied at the Paris Conservatory during that time. And the approach at that school was one emphasizing fundamentals of music. And the idea was that you would train musicians in the fundamentals, and then they would apply them to the various specialties, whether they're instrumentalists or vocalists or whatever. And they would apply these principles to any music that they performed. Many of the leading woodwind players in the United States, including the very famous Marcel Tabuteau of the Philadelphia Orchestra, Curtis Institute of Music, and I think generally regarded as the father of American oboe playing, studied in that program. What is very interesting about all of that is that most of the musicians who came through that program ended up in major symphony orchestras throughout the world. And yet, the Paris Conservatory, during those years, did not have an orchestral training program. They did not even have an orchestra. The idea was you train the musicians in the principles of music, and then they learn on the job when they get the job. Now, that was quite possible in those days. It's not possible today. People who aspire for symphony careers must be trained and must know the job and know all of the repertoire before they arrive in the orchestras, because it's like jumping on a moving train. Those are repertory companies, just like theater repertory companies. They have to be ready to go on the job tomorrow. My first week in the Los Angeles Philharmonic, I had to play the E-flat trumpet part to the Ein Heldenleben, and because the orchestra had played it and they rehearsed it and done numerous performances the year before, they didn't feel it necessary to do any rehearsals, and so I went cold for most of it. And when I complained to the personnel manager, I said, I haven't had a chance to even try to play this part in rehearsal. And he said, "You're here because we expect you to know how to do that. That's it. That's why you're here." There is no doubt that large ensembles such as major symphony orchestras, jazz bands, any field of music, including all of the soloists, there's no question the playing is far better than it has ever been. And those who would like to refer to the good old days, they weren't the good old days. They don't compare in any way. However, I do think that it's regrettable that individuals are not allowed the chance to develop their own ideas more than they could, simply because, if for no other reason, they're trying to keep up with the rigors of the profession, just trying to keep their heads above water. Things can be very difficult, working especially at the top levels. It is my hope that by putting out this teaching video showing the way William Vacchiano approached things and the way musicians in those olden times approached music from the fundamentals of musicianship perspective, that maybe it might spur some on to experiment and try to look at things, if for no other reason, to have a certain amount of flexibility in approaching music, or as the famous violinist Isaac Stern always said, there's more than one way to skin a cat.